And we're doing it again. My name is Joe Lennon, and I am a teacher at the Language Center at Maastricht University. Most of you probably know that. Abbie and I have started a program or a lab, we call it, the writing lab at Maastricht University.
I don't know how to give it too much.
And so yes, could I ask you all please for the moment to mute your microphone? Because right now I'm getting a lot of echoes and noise. Anyway, we run the writing lab at the Language Center, and our mission in life is to make everyone better writers. And this little series of online lessons is one of our ways of doing that. So welcome to you all. Thanks for coming. Actually, Abbie, maybe do you want to introduce yourself, and then I'll take it over from there.
Yeah, of course. Good morning, everyone. Sorry, I've temporarily muted all of you, those of you who were unmuted myself. So if you want to speak and you can't, for whatever reason, if you can't unmute yourself, definitely let one of us know so that we can solve the problem, because it happened last time. But in the meantime, my name is Abbie. As Joe mentioned, I work with him at the Writing Center. We co-teach courses on writing, both at the Faculty of Social Studies and at the Faculty of Arts. And I come from a background in English language and literature, still working on my PhD, slowly but surely. That's what I tell myself every day when I don't get things done, but you know, it's a process, just like writing. So, good morning. Happy to have all of you here. I think we've admitted up to 16 people now. Joe, would you like to start? Because the topic today that we're gonna talk to all of you about is introductions and conclusions. And we decided it would be a little bit too crazy if we started with conclusions and then went backwards to introductions. So maybe Joe, do you want to start?
Some strange sound making people here.
I'll try to mute as I see it becomes problematic.
Okay, cool. Okay, yeah, I mean, the topic today is intros and conclusions, and it comes out of, I think, Abbie and I, and our colleagues, and maybe some of you as well, seeing, sorry to say it, but so many bad, boring introductions and conclusions. But then on the flip side, so many relatively simple and useful introductions and conclusions. So it's our mission to sort of today to, probably both of us, I'm guessing, are gonna say a few words about what an intro or conclusion shouldn't be, and then we're gonna focus more on what it can be and give you some specific tips and strategies for doing that. I don't know how much Abbie's going to talk about the actual process of writing the intro or conclusion. I'm gonna talk about it in the sense that, so I'm going to start with introductions, and then Abbie's going to do conclusions. So, you know, many students always ask me, like, when should I write the introduction? And so I think that's a really good question. There's no one answer, though. Everybody has different answers. So I'm sure some of you, you know, try to write your conclusion at the beginning to sort of help you get an idea of you know, and maybe to help you get excited. For me, it's sort of, sometimes it helps me get more excited about the piece if I try to write the intro at the beginning, because I'm like, yeah, my audience is going to see these cool things at the beginning, and that's exciting. But then I think I always come back at the end after I've written the whole piece and then say, how can I make the introduction more suitable for the whole piece? So probably a lot of you, you know, follow that type of process. But I guess what I'm going to try and show you, so in a second I'll share my screen, and I have just a little presentation for you. I have sort of I narrowed my focus down to one guiding principle that for me, I hope is useful when you're thinking about an introduction. And then I have 4 forms or strategies for constructing a introduction. And I think actually some of them might be also ways of doing 2 things at once: writing an introduction, but also maybe getting you, how should I say it? Breaking through maybe some writer's block and using sort of formal tricks maybe to get you into interesting places in your writing. Well, I'll try to explain what I mean. So let me share my screen, and let's do that. I'm still a Zoom newbie, relatively, so give me a second. I need to open maybe the file first. I bet that will do it. Yes. Okay, can you see my white and black hipster font display? Good. Okay, I'm seeing nodding faces, or at least 2 nodding faces, so that's good. Okay, so like I said, I have 1 principle for you, and then 4 sort of forms that you can try when you're writing your introduction. And the principle is keep it moving. And another way of saying that is momentum, movement, momentum. Every sentence should propel the reader further down into the good stuff. And the good stuff is, one assumes, your paper, the main body of the paper that has the content that you really want to share with people. And so, I should have said this at the beginning. I'm talking when I'm talking about the introductions. I'll try to be relatively clear about whether I'm talking about more strictly academic pieces of writing, and then maybe more journalistic or popular pieces of writing. But the principle, I believe, is the same no matter what. So I'm going to try and show you what I mean by that. So, but there you have a little hint as to the forms that are coming. And you might understand some of those things, you might not, but I will get to those. So one sort of message that goes along with the principle that I want to share with you is the sentence of death. And the sentence of death is, this paper is about X and whatever your topic is. In other words, a sentence where you are simply stating what the paper is about. Some variations on that would be, this paper deals with blank. Anything where you are simply stating as a sort of statement the topic, and not saying what you are going to do with that topic or what is going to happen. So we're talking about making statements about states rather than movement, about actions. And I see so many, I mean, I just read a round of, so I don't know if any of my students are here, but I just read a round of student papers again, and so many papers start with this kind of statement. This paper is about blank. What I'm going to try and show you, I guess, and maybe what I hope you also realize, is that a sentence like that is doing nothing that will help you. Because there are ways to make your topic clear while also saying, as I said, what you are going to do about it or what you're going to do with it. Okay, so let me, okay. I wanted to show you this example of a abstract, because an abstract is a form of introduction, or at least I'm treating it as a form of introduction. And almost everyone, all of us, have to write abstracts at some point, and many of us have to write them in English. But I'm just going to read the abstract to you, and the point that I want to make here is at the top there. Every sentence here is multitasking. It means every sentence is doing more than just saying what the topic is. It's saying what is going to be done with the topic, or what is important, right? So what's happening and what's important. So this is a scientific paper. Clever title, How Voting is Like Taking an SAT Test. If you're not an American, you might not get that reference. The SAT test is one of the big American standardized tests. But actually, that doesn't matter too much. I think you'll still understand it. So millions of American voters fail to complete their ballots each election year. These voters present a puzzle. After having incurred the costs of going to the polls, why do they choose not to vote on some of the items on the ballot? This paper considers voter roll-off between presidential and House races in an effort to understand the reasons why some voters abstain selectively. We consider this question by analyzing House roll-off based on aggregate data from the 1990s and national survey data from the 1980s. The results indicate that voters skip House contests, not because they are lacking in education or members of minority groups, but rather because they do not have enough information to cast a vote. This finding offers new insight into how roll-off voters approach a ballot. They treat voting as if it were a test, picking out the questions that they can answer. I'm going to show you in a second a model called the CARS model, and then I'm going to come back to this, and you'll see how sort of amazingly the first 3 sentences of this abstract basically cover the 3 steps of the CARS. But first, I just wanted to show you this as I said, an example where every sentence is doing something. Especially, look at that third sentence. This paper considers voter roll-off between presidential and House races. That's the first part of the sentence. And the first part of the sentence is an example, would be an example of the sentence of death, right? That we might see in sort of less effective introductions, because it stops there. It just says what the paper is about. But what is the second half of the sentence doing? In an effort to understand, it's saying the purpose of the of what is being done, right? So that's the principle. The principle is make your sentences be doing work. Every sentence counts in an introduction. Whoops. One of the most useful models that I use in my classes and that I use when I'm writing a paper is called CARS, and that doesn't stand for the vehicle, but it stands for Creating a Research Space. It was a model developed by John Swales, and he thought that he noticed he studied I think mainly social science papers, academic papers, and he found that there were generally 3 moves that he sort of could see happening in most academic introductions. And I've used, and that's his word, move, and I love it because, again, it reminds you that everything in the introduction should be moving towards moving the reader further down into the paper, and not sort of just stating disconnected facts or something like that. So the first move is establishing the territory. What's going on? So another way of saying that is context, but also a little, what you should be doing in this move is starting to say, why should anyone care about the thing that I'm going to be writing about? So you have to show somehow that it's worth caring about, that it's worth being interested in. The second move is establishing the niche. So another way of saying that is, what's the problem? In other words, so in this field, in this research field, in this area of thinking, there's some kind of issue, some kind of problem that I want to address. So the problem might be other researchers have not considered this particular thing. And so there's what we can call a research gap. And then finally, you have the third move, which is occupying the niche. By the way, you know, I don't know if niche is an international word, but basically a little. Okay, I'm seeing a nod, so maybe it is. So hopefully you know what that means. But a place, basically, creating a place, creating a research space. The move 3 is occupying the niche. That means, what am I going to do about it? What is the writer of this article going to do? How am I going to tackle this issue or this problem? So just to go slightly back for a second to that abstract. What I admire about this abstract is the 3 sentences are perfect, I think, examples of the 3 moves. The first move, establishing the territory. Millions of American voters failed to complete their ballots. Now, it's not only establishing the territory, it's already getting into the second issue, is what is the problem? But then, more specifically, these voters present a puzzle. And I love that word, puzzle, right? It's a wonderful way to describe the problem. What is the question? What is the issue? They're not voting, and you know, somebody might see that as a problem. Then, in the third sentence, this paper considers voter roll-off between presidential and House races. So, right there, you have what the author of this paper is going to do about this problem, how they're going to address the issue. So, there you have a quick look at CARS. So CARS is not only useful for strictly academic introductions, but I think many other types of papers as well. And so I'm kind of, as I go through the forms, it's going to be a continuum sort of from more strictly academic to maybe a bit more what you might do in a journalistic or a popular article. The next form I wanted to show you is an epigraph. And an epigraph is basically a quotation at the very top of a text. Okay, so in this text, it's a article on, I would call this an academic article, actually, but it's maybe sort of a popular academic article. At least it's published on the university website. The links, by the way, I think Abbie and I are going to share these presentations online, so you'll have the links and you'll be able to look again at these later. So we have the title, and then right after the title, we have a quotation. The important elements of modern architecture: hygiene, air, light, cleansing, airing, heating, artificial lighting. In this case, we don't see who said that. We have a citation, but the mystery is not left for too long, because right in the very first sentence of the first paragraph, the author identifies the speaker. With these words, the Czech architect and critic Oldřich Study sought to identify the central features of the most progressive architecture in the 1920s. I'm not going to read the rest of that. You can do that later. But what I want to say about this is, it's often, I recommend, not only is an epigraph sort of a cool, formal thing to do. I mean, it makes, there's all sorts of things that it does. It sort of gives you immediately some, you know, putting the words of some well-known author or someone representative in your field at the top of your paper gives you some credentials already. You know, you can say, look, I've been reading cool stuff and I'm smart. But in this case, I like it because it also, it leads, the quotation leads directly into the argument that the writer wants to make. So not only is this a cool, for the reader, but what I want to stress here is this could be another trick or tip for getting over writer's block and maybe getting started on that introduction. If you don't know how to start your introduction, start with a quotation. either from your sources, maybe the most interesting, quotation, the most challenging quotation, put it there at the top of your document, and respond to it, react to it in your words, in your writing. And even if you don't end up using that, what you produce in your final paper, I think it can be really helpful as a way of you finding your words, your response to some of the sources that you have. So it's two in one. It's both a formal way to start the introduction, but also a useful sort of part of the process maybe for you. I just quickly, this isn't an epigraph, but it's basically the same thing. This is from another scientific paper. And here, it's a little bit less sophisticated. We have a Chinese proverb. The Chinese proverb, "We see what is behind our eyes," captures one of the major dilemmas currently engaging both anthropological scholarship and the broader public. What the author is doing here is just, again, using a quotation to sort of, to do that first move in the cars, to establish their territory. And again, show that they're well-read and sort of sophisticated thinkers. So quotation, epigraph, I see it as basically the same thing. Okay, another thing is an anecdote, a little story that again, hopefully with this little story, you are establishing the territory. You are beginning to introduce the problem, and maybe also beginning to introduce how you are going to solve it. But I showed this example. This is again from a academic paper, and so I ask my students, do you think you can start an academic paper with a story? And most of them say, no, what are you talking about? But then I show them this. And this is one of my favorite academic papers. It's about, it's called "Social Scientists Don't Say Titwank." It's about how this researcher was studying pornography. And so he felt he had to use sort of pornographic language in his paper, and he was told by his superiors and his colleagues, "You can't do that. You can't use naughty words in your academic paper." And so the whole paper is writing about the sort of absurdity of that. But it starts with a little story. In 2004, I submitted a manuscript to a leading journal of social science. It was accepted for publication, but the referees asked for a number of revisions. Okay, I'm not going to read the filthy quotation that follows there, but the point is that, the writing task that I sometimes give my students is to write about I call it the aha moment. The moment when if you've chosen your topic and you're interested in it, but maybe you're trying to show other people why it might be interesting, right? Sort of doing that first move in the cars. So write about that aha moment. So again, like the epigraph, it's another sort of trick you can use if you're stuck, you don't know what to do next. Write about that moment, turn it into a little story. The moment when you realized your topic was interesting to you, or your topic was important to you, or that it matters. Write about that moment. And I call it the aha moment. And essentially, that's what Alan McKee, this author, has done. And he ended up putting it in the introduction, creating the introduction from that little anecdote or that little story. And the final form that I wanted to show you is called in medias res, and many of you might know this already. Now we're probably getting into, I couldn't find a academic article that strictly uses what I would call in medias res. So now we're probably talking more about popular articles or journalistic articles, but we're talking about really almost all of them. I mean, so many writers use this trick. And basically it's the trick of starting the story in the middle. So in other words, don't start your paper by saying octopus. So this article that we're looking at here is about octopuses or octopi, why their brains work the way they do. So a death for this article would be starting with octopuses are a cephalopod that lives in the ocean. Their brain is 45 millimeters. I mean, I'm just making up stuff, but notice that that's not at all what we get. We don't get some broad overview of the topic. What instead we get is a mystery. In 2018, the staff at Sea Star Aquarium in Coburg, Germany had a mystery on their hands. 2 mornings in a row, they had arrived to work to find the aquarium eerily silent. The entire electrical system had shorted out. You can probably guess who is the culprit of this electrical mystery. But anyway, even if you can slightly guess, the story, the introduction immediately puts you into the middle of the story. Then I've left enough here for you, hopefully, to see that then it goes back and says, okay, what am I really going to focus on? In this case, it ends up being a very scientifically sophisticated article. But yeah, so, again, another way, once you've maybe written your whole paper, consider, the introduction does not and should not be the most broad overview of the topic imaginable. It can start right in the middle. It can start right in the heart of things. And that's how you're going to draw in your reader. So I have talked way over the time that I am supposed to. So I'm going to turn it over to Abbie, and she will take it from there and talk about conclusions. But yeah, we'll share the presentations for you later, so you can find some of these articles. All right.
Okay, thanks so much, Joe. And also, hi to everybody who's recently joined us. I've been adding you in slowly, bit by bit, and I've muted you for the time being, but definitely towards the end, when we ask you for your input, you can unmute yourselves, and I can also help you to unmute yourselves if there's some kind of strange, anomalous occurrence like last time where nobody could speak. But I'm gonna do conclusions now. And I mean, contrary to Joe, well, to most people, I'm a little bit of a weirdo when I write. I don't write my introduction first. I actually write my introduction after my conclusion. But in terms of the order of things, when you want to write a paper, I usually kind of go in order from body paragraph to conclusion, because I want to try to wrap something up. And that kind of gets into the idea of the main aims of a conclusion and what it should do. So I'm going to share my screen now. And I've prepared a small, very kitsch kind of looking presentation with a lot of words, but just to kind of make sure that everything I'm saying can be understood and read and is accessible when we put this online, so that maybe people who are not here can join in, and they can also kind of have the commentary. But before I get into this, I wanted to express a sentiment of solidarity with anybody who ever feels something similar to this meme. They start off writing, their introduction looks good, first paragraph looks good, the second and third paragraph is where the meat and the bones are, it's awesome, and then you get to the conclusion and you're exhausted, and it looks something like this horrifying Winnie the Pooh creation down here. And that is often how I feel when I have to go and to write a conclusion for my paper, even if I haven't or I already have written my introduction. So for that reason, one of the things I like to do before I write my conclusion, if I haven't procrastinated, of course, like most of us tend to do, is I actually go away from my body paragraphs and what I've written, and I come back maybe a day later and I reread it to see and make sure that I really know what I'm talking about. Because, to share yet another meme, I'm gonna read it here. When you're writing the conclusion to your essay and suddenly realize that everything you've said up to that point makes no sense whatsoever. It's happened to me. It's probably happened to some of you. It happens to the best of us. We forget, or we use maybe a little bit too elaborate of language, or we've lost kind of the main focus of our paper, our essay, or our article. And this would be a moment when I would go back and look at my body paragraphs before I started to write my conclusion, because the key to writing a conclusion is understanding the message that you want to get across to the reader in a clear, concise, concrete way, so that they have this feeling of completeness by the time that they end, but not just completeness. So I'm going to move on now to the presentation I've prepared for you. Presentation, yeah. And I'm going to go ahead and hide my thumbnails. Voila. So I've given it a short but sweet little title here. Writing conclusions is awesome, said no one ever. Yeah, difficult for me as well. Even doesn't matter how many of them I get to write. And also, I really like this statement. Often, the sum of a paper is worth more than its parts. So oftentimes, because the conclusion is the last impression you're going to leave upon your reader, it can be worth a little bit more than just the sum of each part individually, the sum of each body paragraph individually. So that being said, I wanted to kind of explain what a conclusion should actually do, because I think that we all have this kind of very mechanical idea of what a conclusion looks like. In conclusion, to summarize, this is what I talked about in this paragraph, this is what I talked about in this paragraph, and this was my thesis statement, except backwards and reverse. This is what I've accomplished, and, you know, thank you for reading my essay, essentially, kind of like we do in presentations. But what a conclusion should actually do is, one, stress the importance of the thesis, hypothesis statement. It could be the theme of your essay. This applies to writing in general. Two, it should give this essay or piece of writing a sense of completeness. And three, it should leave, of course, as I mentioned, the final impression on the reader. It's the last words, so to speak, before they go away from your paper. But you'll notice in pink, just below each of these three things, the problematics of that, giving this kind of very vague advice. So stress the importance, but how do you do this? Yeah, give the completeness within the essay, give the sense of completeness. But what does completeness mean? Yeah, and leave the final impression on the reader. Sounds a bit easier said than done, in my opinion. At least that's what I find when I go to write conclusions. So what I put together for you are not necessarily models of good and bad conclusions, because I hate separating them into good and bad, because I think that this gets into a kind of weird punitive discussion. And I think that we can always reorganize our conclusions and take some good parts, eliminate maybe less good parts, and then replace them and rework them and edit them, as we focused on in our previous talk. So I've got some strategies for you. The first one, and the one that I think is the most important, is reread, think, and ask yourself, so what? Yeah, you've read your paper, you've written it, and what do you want to convey? What's the point, essentially? So maybe when you reread, start with your introduction. You can keep going as well into your body paragraphs. Just like the meme I showed you a minute ago, make sure that it's comprehensible to you, because if it's not going to be comprehensible to your reader. And then show your readers, or tell them, why this article, essay, whatever it may be, or this thesis and hypothesis was important. How does it contribute to the larger discussion on the topic? Meaning, you know, within academic circles, but it could be also in terms of the popularity of the topic for general essays or for poetry or whatever it is that you really want to write. And then finally, explain why your contribution is meaningful and purposeful. And those are really complex terms, and when you want to try to think about what does meaningful and purposeful and useful mean, and essentially, what is the point of writing it? Why should somebody read it? So by the time they get to the end of your essay, they should be thinking, okay, So what? And your conclusion should try to answer that question. The next thing, or strategy, is to remember to synthesize and not just summarize. So synthesizing is not just repeating all the things that were already said in your paper, because the funny thing is, everybody's already read, well, your reader has already read your paper. They don't want to reread it in a tiny form in a paragraph. That would be something more akin to an abstract. So what you want to do is try to show how all the points you've made throughout your essay in your body paragraphs, how they actually come together to support each other as a part of a larger argument or a larger theme. So show them how the points you made and the support and examples you used were not random, but fit together to make a kind of complete puzzle. That's the difference between a summary and a synthesis. The next strategy I have for you would be to redirect the readers. And what this means is they should not be reading your essay, your academic article, I don't know, whatever it may be that you're writing. They should not be reading it in isolation. It should be connected to something larger, either a larger discussion in terms of what's going on in the scholarly circles, or when you're doing a literature review, how can you contribute to what's already been written by scholars on the topic? But it's also more general than that in terms of you want to kind of connect it to the real world. Think about it in terms of yourself. What kind of impact has this paper that you've just spent time reading? What kind of impact does it have on you? Does it make you think globally? Can you, as the writer, kind of connect your message to what's going on in the real world? And I think that a lot of this relates back to what Joe was saying with his strategies for writing an introduction. You can start off with some kind of anecdotal story that kind of explains, submitting a manuscript or beginning to write, or perhaps an instance of failure that turned into success. These types of real world analogies, let's say, or examples can kind of serve to create something really essential in your conclusion and introduction, this kind of link between you and the reader. You want to make them feel invested. You want to make them think about how it applies to the world, because this is what's going to leave that final impact when they leave your paper and then go to read another or go about their day, whatever they may be doing. Okay. Now I have show new perspectives. And what this means is essentially kind of create new meanings for topics that you're already perhaps looking into that may be really popular. Maybe you're diving into classic literature. Maybe you're looking at a kind of scientific discovery that's already had a whole body of research done on it. It doesn't mean that you always have to create something new and exciting every single time. What you can also do is look at old perspectives or old findings, and you can build on those and show how your hypothesis or thesis or idea can kind of fit into the existing discussion. Or you can, of course, create some kind of new meaning for the topic that you're going into. So you want to kind of demonstrate how your ideas in your paper that you've just written, that you want people to invest time in reading, you want to show them how your ideas work together so that you can kind of create a new perspective on the issue. So they work together both within the piece of writing, the essay, the journal article, the piece of research, literature review, show how they work together within the paper, but also connect them essentially outside to a broader discussion of what's going on the topic. If nothing's going on the topic, that's also worth mentioning that this is an entirely new field, this is an entirely new endeavor, and I'm going to try to do some kind of study or research on this because the scholarship on the topic is a bit lacking. Yeah. Now, to do those 4 things, I came up with just a few tips for, of course, the conclusion itself, but also the essay in general. But this is where they would become really impactful. So one of the things you can do, especially for what I just mentioned in terms of showing new perspectives on existing research and how you can connect new ideas about, what's already been said 1,000 times, you can challenge your reader, prompt them to kind of redirect the information in your paper or article and apply it to their own lives. And what that means is you want to try to challenge them with a different perspective. something quite impactful. It could be controversial. It could be quite profound. It could be quite new if you're diving into a new body that hasn't already been discussed in literary circles or scholarly circles, scholarly circles already. And you want to try to think about how they can apply what you've just written to their own lives. Are they going to go and do further research on the topic because they found what you've just written so interesting? Or are they going to think about the literature review they've already done and think, yeah, actually, that reminds me of something I've already read on this issue, and I think that this is a really good contribution, and I can kind of use it to build on my own ideas if they're, doing research. Another tip would be, and I like this one a lot, is ask key questions. So posing questions either to the reader or in general, kind of a broad scope that the reader doesn't have to answer. It could be rhetorical, it could be open-ended. This actually might help the reader gain a new perspective on the topic, like I mentioned earlier, and they may not have actually thought about this before reading your conclusion. It can also bring all the main ideas together and perhaps create a new meaning. So by having already written your entire paper and then posing a key question about the issue, perhaps a key question that could be looking into further research that could be done on the topic, or a key question relating back to how the individual feels or how society is reflected today on the issue or focus of your paper, what you can actually do is get them to think critically by the end when they're reading your conclusion. And how this would differ and be a little bit, let's say, radical when you write a conclusion is you might not want to start or end your conclusion paragraph or page with, in conclusion, to summarize, essentially what I've said is, what you could actually do is ask a question about the topic. Yeah? Next I have explain what comes next. And this is kind of straightforward. You don't want to just ask questions and kind of synthesize what you've already written in your paper, but you want to connect it to a sense of belonging in terms of contributing to literature in the field or research currently being done. You want to offer the reader and also other researchers reading your paper or your essay, where can they go from here? What are the next steps to be taken about the hypothesis or claim that you've just made? And this also kind of applies to writing in general, whether it's for a thesis or an academic article, or if it's an essay, maybe perhaps a kind of critical, socially scientific essay would be a little bit more appropriate here than a creative one, but you want to try to get them to think what's going to be done next about this topic. So what else can we explore? Perhaps we can explore the connections to this topic. We can do further research on this aspect in the paper, or we're waiting for this book to come out that's already being published by leading researchers, and we can see how this hypothesis connects to what's going to be done in that text that's going to come out at a later date. So you want to kind of give them a sense that it doesn't necessarily end here, even though it's the conclusion. It's actually more of just a gigantic pause, and ideally they're going to go from there into the next reading on the topic. And then a really common one, we want to, gone a little bit too far, we want to echo but not repeat the introduction. And I want to stress, do not repeat the introduction, because oftentimes, myself included, in elementary school and high school, when they were teaching us how to write an essay, they were saying, oh, the conclusion is really the introduction paragraph, but in reverse. So the first sentence comes last, and you flip them all around, and then you have a perfect conclusion. You have to re-say your thesis statement. Don't say it in the same words, maybe paraphrase it so it's something different, and that's how you make a conclusion. And I would say, unfortunately, they failed me a little bit, because that is not the most effective conclusion. Similar to what Joe shared, it's not the most effective introduction when you kind of start off with these dead sentences. This paper will be about, we're going to discuss this, or if the Oxford Dictionary defines whales as this kind of dead kind of introduction, it can also have the same effect in the conclusion. So in summary, what I've discussed in this paper, what I endeavored to prove in my argument was this. That's a little bit problematic because they've already read it. You don't want to bore your reader. But what you can do when you consider echo, don't repeat the introduction, is you can try to bring the reader full circle. So this would be a kind of thematic topic, maybe related to your thesis statement, or maybe related to a theme or an anecdotal story that you brought up in your introduction. You want to kind of give them a sense of completeness or an ending. So if you started off with a story about perhaps how your manuscript was rejected so many times, for example, Harry Potter was rejected so many times before it found a publisher, and this was quite, detrimental to the author, but eventually she succeeded. If we want to start an essay with this kind of anecdotal instance, that if you persevere and keep going, you can succeed, by the end of your conclusion, you would want to kind of give a wrap-up sentence to say, so if we keep trying, if we never give up, if we're always looking for that next source where we can give our ideas, or try to apply for this or try to apply for that, get a new perspective on what's written, never take no for an answer, then, just then, maybe you can find a publisher. You can become the next J.K. Rowling. So this would be an example of coming kind of full circle. Off the top of my head, of course, it's not beautiful writing, but that's an example of what that kind of means. And then, not to keep you too much longer, the basic message of what I wanted to get across with these strategies and these tips is don't repeat, be concrete, be clear, concise, to the point. Don't be too wordy and try to, send your reader through this labyrinth to try to discover what it is you actually mean by what you're trying to say. Ask questions. Your paper or your essay should ask questions. It should provoke thought. And then, of course, don't just ask questions, but connect ideas, both within the essay, paper, article itself, but also connect ideas to the broader field of what's going on about the topic, what's being discussed in literature, and where people can actually go from here, connect it to the future. So, in other words, the paper, the essay, the idea doesn't die with the conclusion. It's just a huge pause or ellipsis, 3 dots. It's a huge ellipsis towards what can come from there. Yeah? And I've put a couple of funny memes in here for you because I'm a meme-related person. And you'll see up in the left, I finally found it, the treasure, the scroll of truth, after years of searching. And the scroll of truth, of course, says the conclusion and the introduction are the hardest parts to write. And I think that that's absolutely true. For myself, having written many of them, they're the parts of the essay that oftentimes need the most revision. And also, they're oftentimes the part of the essay that I tend to write in a very unconventional order. I usually start with my body paragraphs, and then I think how I can end it with my conclusion, and then I go back to my introduction. Because the idea for me with introductions is I don't really know what I'm introducing until I've already explained it and said it. And then I can prepare a kind of proper introduction to my whole topic for you. And the second one is for anybody who's a Simpsons fan. I found this a little bit funny because sometimes, this is obviously hyperbolic, it's an exaggeration, but sometimes what I see when I read student essays, it's not a bad approach, but it's just kind of a dead sentence, as Joe mentioned. In conclusion, moreover, therefore, here are all the same sentences I used in my introduction, just backwards and in Pig Latin. Thank you for reading my essay, the end. So this would be maybe something that we want to try to avoid. We want to go back to those main messages of don't repeat, be concrete, ask questions, and then definitely answer those questions and connect them to broader ideas. So that's as much as I'm going to ramble about my tips. I'm not going to go into models of good or bad introductions because I think that opens up a whole broad, longer discussion. And of course, I would need to put a whole bunch of text on the screen. I don't want to bore you with that. What I want to do, and I think what Joe wants to do, is we want to hear from all of you about your experiences with writing introductions and conclusions. Do you hate them? Do you love them? Are they difficult? Do you kind of agree with what we've said? Do you disagree? I encourage you to challenge us because that's always really fun when we can kind of start a debate about, our ideas versus your ideas, because your experiences as students and as researchers here in the Czech Republic is inherently different from my experience or Joe's experience in terms of where we learned to write. So With that being said, I'm going to go ahead and mute myself temporarily. And I want to ask you, anybody who's brave enough to speak first, what do you think about writing introductions and conclusions?
I just want to jump in, and sorry, then, but yeah, that's something I meant to say as well, Abbie. You reminded me, and I forgot to say it. Is that the way that you introduce and conclude a paper? I think it's actually the most like culturally variant part of a text, the introduction and the conclusion. So yeah, you that's something to take into account, is that both Abbie and I were educated in the U.S. and we're from that writing culture, and we're aware, even if we're not always uh, perfectly sensitive to it, and we're trying to get more sensitive to it. But I think both of us are aware that there's different, that the academic culture in Central Europe, for example, is different, and the academic writing culture is different, and therefore what needs to be done in an introduction, for example, if you're writing a thesis for Maastricht University, might be different from these sorts of things. But I think what we've tried to do is give you, as best as we know, a sort of more general, effective, reader-based. I mean, both of us are coming from a reader-based writing culture. In other words, the reader, we want to watch out for the reader and what helps them understand my purpose and my paper. So, okay, so now we will shut up and we want to hear from you.
Maybe in the silence, one more thing I'll revisit would be what you just said, Joe. It's really important when you have this kind of general writing advice, and we are actually sensitive to this aspect, is that the two, in my opinion, most important elements of writing are the purpose of what you want to write, whatever it may be, whatever form it takes, but also the audience. And by audience, we mean the reader. For whom will this paper be? And a lot of times for students or researchers, that ends up being your professor. And that's why you kind of have to stick to these standard models of, in conclusion, to summarize, my paper will discuss. But it doesn't mean that you always have to write like that, especially when you do further research and you start reading papers by perhaps English-speaking academics. You'll see what we mean by the culture is completely different than the Czech culture. So with that being said, what do you think?
Anyone working on an introduction right now, and you want some ideas, want some advice or conclusion?
Or perhaps I've muted you and you can't unmute yourself.
Hello? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh yeah. Maybe I can also somehow. Wow. Let's see. Hi.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would just like to say that maybe, yeah, everything what you have said really makes sense and is a nice, I would say, summary. And I completely agree with you. Like always, when I'm writing, I write only academic papers.
Mm-hmm.
So, and always when I'm writing, I think it's really important to read it after some time, maybe even like wait 1 or 2 days and then read it, or at the end at least read it the whole story. So because then I really don't like when things are repeated. And sometimes also if I'm reading like articles after students, they have, for example, 2 sentences which are in fact the same, describe the same, just different different words used. And yeah, so I try to omit this and to make it shorter and more like dense, I would say. I'm not really sure whether, like, I'm from the field of biology, so no social sciences. So I'm not very sure if I could use what you were talking about, like some of these questions maybe, or yeah, or stories. I'm not really sure about it. What do you think? Would it be also?
If I could challenge that notion, I was having a discussion with my students at the beginning of the semester before the quarantine, because I had a whole bunch of Faculty of Science students all of a sudden in my Faculty of Arts course. So it was blindsiding me, but also it was awesome because I got to hear their concerns, which very much echo yours. How do I apply what you've just said to what I have to write? Because obviously my audience is professors at the Faculty of Science, and they expect a certain standard. I would say what you have to say is absolutely valid, and it's different than something you would write at the Faculty of Arts or Social Studies. But at the same time, I would kind of challenge that thought that once they move beyond the bachelor level, the master level, when they move beyond this expectation of the professor that their English needs to fit in this neat little box of very eloquent terms and very lengthy sentence descriptions. When they move beyond that, the idea, in my opinion, is to go back to what I like to think of as academic writing versus creative writing. We always separate those two for some reason. But academic writing, the purpose of it is to educate, right? We want to educate our reader about the research we've just made, what we've just accomplished and done. And while a lot of that is going to have a lot of very specific terminology, which is necessary, I would say that the more restrictive we get with our language and our terminology, the more inaccessible we are to readers outside of the bubble of just educated experts from the same field. And if that's the purpose, if we are writing for our colleagues or just our professor, then they've done their job. They should absolutely write these very eloquent, lofty, formal sentences, formal register sentences to try to convey their idea. But beyond that, if we want to kind of bring these scientific publications to a little bit of a wider audience, like maybe educated experts not from the same field, not from biology, maybe from a different branch of science, or if I can bring that farther, educated experts maybe from a different faculty, but who have still obviously undergone university education at the master's or doctoral level. And then if I can bring that even further, and I can say educated non-experts, people from different degree programs like myself, the Faculty of Arts, if you can write a paper, a scientific paper, a journal article, and you can bring your idea to me in some kind of relatable way, then you have broadened actually this kind of sphere of academic writing. It's no longer this tiny bubble of educated experts of the same field. You've now broadened it to a bigger bubble where you're not only talking to educated experts in the same field, but you're actually talking to perhaps me. And I might be able to understand your idea, your research in your paper. And that doesn't mean that you have to write your entire paper in this kind of watered down way, trying to cater to somebody who doesn't know anything about your topic or your research. It just means that perhaps even for especially the introduction, maybe more so, maybe the introduction and conclusion, you could kind of simplify it at certain parts to try to reach a wider audience. And I think I gave this example last time. I really like this video series from physicist Michio Kaku. And he's obviously a brilliant man. And he starts off by trying to explain the theory of extra dimensions, which to me, I would have no idea what that meant if I were reading a paper, a journal article from a physics journal. I wouldn't be able to comprehend all the terminology. But going into that, introducing me into the topic to get me thinking about it, what he does is he gives the metaphor of a koi fish in a koi pond, and the dimension that the koi fish sees is only the pond. He only sees his fish friends, he only sees what he can swim in, and this is his world. And then when we lift the fish out of the world with our hands into the human world, the fish now comprehends that not only did his small world and his pond exist, all of his fish friends wherever he was swimming, but also this bigger world with these strange beings, humans, us, also exist. So the fish, the koi fish, is also suddenly hit with the sudden reality that there is another dimension just beyond what he already previously understood. And obviously this wasn't the entire discussion of Professor Kaku, but it was the introduction to it. And it really piqued my interest as somebody not into the field of physics. I was like, that makes sense to me. This is a really cool idea. I want to read more on the topic. So then I might slowly try to become a little bit more educated on the theory of extra dimensions, and I might start getting into more scientific articles from the field of physics. So in that way, maybe you could use some of, I think, Joe's really helpful advice to kind of hook your reader in the introduction, give them something that they can bite into, because you want them to keep reading. Yeah, you want them to keep their interest, maintain their interest. But then, of course, this always goes back to purpose and audience. If the purpose and audience is just to reach educated experts in your field, then obviously writing introductions and conclusions in this very complex type of way to explain complex phenomena is going to be the most appropriate. But if you want to reach a little bit of a wider audience, you could consider the occasional metaphor, the occasional anecdote, and then you could go into your research. Maybe that might be in some ways applicable. You can also completely disagree.
Yeah, it could be. For sure, it is, I would say, inspiring. And yeah, I can perhaps try it. And I guess that it could be more suitable for like open access publishing, because actually open access everyone can reach. So then at least, yeah, to catch the attention maybe. But still, like, I mean, in if it is for the mostly for the researchers audience, then there need to be certain specifications and terms used and everything. But I agree with you that the introduction would be perhaps more tricky, or I don't know how to say.
If I can say something that might be helpful in this regard, because I think, Petra, you're absolutely right that, yeah, I mean, the forms that, some of the specific forms that I shared, obviously, well, I don't know, an epigraph, I think that could I feel like I've seen that in scientific papers. Yeah, in medias res, where you're sort of starting in the middle of, when I entered the laboratory, obviously that sort of thing you're not going to see in an strictly academic article. Anecdote, maybe not. I guess I would say, of the forms that I shared, though, I would still want to hang on, even in strictly scientific writing, I would still want to hang on and encourage sort of thinking about it in the CARS method, as far as what's the field, what's the situation in the field, what's the specific problem that I'm trying to address, and how am I going to address it in this study. I think those are absolutely valid and useful in writing an introduction or an abstract, even for the most strictly scientific paper. Obviously, and what Abbie was talking about then is, if we're talking about what exact kind of language you're doing that in, yeah, then also we have to discuss, like, obviously, if you're writing for people in your field, you're not going to use, this metaphorical language necessarily. You're going to want to say it directly using the specific vocabulary. But then the next step we can talk about is on the micro level, on the sentence level, constructing your sentences so that they follow that principle of always moving the reader further down into the paper, rather than, as I said, just saying, this paper discusses the mitochondrial, effect of blah, blah, blah. Blah, blah, blah. Mitochondria are blah, 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 blah. That's what I would, if you can at all avoid that, and create sentences that are based around actions, based around the action of the actions that are taking place in the field, and the actions of you as the researcher. What am I doing, or what are we doing, if you want to use we, or what is the study doing? What effect does it have? Why is it important? I think those are all still valid for even the strictest scientific writing. And unfortunately, it's what we sometimes don't, see. And I think those are less effective introductions when they don't bring, they don't impact the reader, right? And say, this is an important study. Because I really think that's what we all should be doing, is showing why something was important. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you.
Anyone want to share some tips that they've learned from their experience writing intros or conclusions? Something that has really helped them that we didn't maybe cover and you want to throw in? We'd love to hear that.
Hello, everybody. I just want to ask you about, is it be okay if I put some citation, for example, in the introduction, and in conclusion, I put a citation, also respectful people, for example, with PhD or the greatest investment, and it's become kind of a debate to the reader in advance. Is it be okay, or it's totally wrong?
I don't think Abbie and I will ever say something is totally wrong. And I think we're always going to answer that kind of question with, it depends on what you're trying to do, who you're trying to reach, and what you're doing with the quotation. I think you mean like putting in a quotation, right?
Yes, it's like, for example, about technical analysis. There is too much information and always debates about pros and cons. But for example, in the beginning, I put that some professor or writer, I don't know, with professional, for example, in finance, and wrote about that technical analysis is 100% the best way to predict some financial behavior and so on the market, for example. And in the end, they put, so well, as you can see, that Mr. Lynch, one of the greatest investor, spoke about technical analysis with a phrase such as financial or the technical analysis, sorry, is the best analysis for past time. What is going for analyze the past, not for the future.
I guess actually we should do, Abbie, we should do a one of these on quotations. I think it could be interesting and how to use those well. But I guess I would, the only thing I would warn you about, Dimitro, with that is make sure that you're not sort of, because at the conclusion, one hopes you have made your argument, as well as you want to make it. And I guess you don't want to like undermine your argument by like just like giving a quotation and saying, so here you can see I'm right because this person agrees with me. I think so. I don't think that's maybe what you were saying you were doing, but I would be careful of giving that impression. You don't want to just throw in a quotation, and you never want to let a quotation make your argument or your point for you, I guess would be the more general advice on that. So just make sure that you're not undercutting your own voice. I think in the conclusion, you want to make, well, throughout the paper, but maybe especially in the conclusion, you want to make your voice the central voice. You don't want to just say, this is what the experts think, and that proves that they agree with me. Or I guess sometimes you do want to do that, but then maybe you also want to be careful. You don't want to introduce totally new lines of argument or new points in the conclusion. So just make sure the quotation isn't introducing, like if the quotation is important to your argument, like if you want to use it to prove something, then I would say it probably doesn't belong in the conclusion. It probably belongs further up in the discussion or in or further up in the paper, or even in the introduction?
Yes, Joseph, but we are not talking about body, but for this exception, my question, sorry, there is the main idea to put some discussion part inside the body to make a reader to think from different way, from new way, to see new possibility. But it'll be possible just to put something good in the introduction and what is real life in the end. And comparing like with that, that the reader can clearly see what's wrong with some theory, or kind of that at least, by the real result from the real world.
I would actually maybe respond to this because Joe and I sometimes agree, sometimes we disagree. We're a little bit of different writers. I would say in the conclusion, that would definitely fit. But of course, following Joe's advice, you don't want to introduce some kind of new idea. But what it could do in an effective way is it could echo the introduction. So if you're going to bring it full circle by perhaps introducing a quotation, first or second sentence of your conclusion, and then challenging, second tip I gave you, challenging your readers to think about that conclusion, how it could either relate to the arguments you made in your paper or relate to the broader question about research in general, then I think it absolutely has a place, these kinds of open-ended, broad, thought-provoking quotations. And then what I would do is I wouldn't just leave the quotation kind of there, you know? I would give maybe 1 or 2 sentences in my conclusion. It depends on how long your paper is, of course. And I would contextualize it slightly for your reader, but then let them do the rest of the thinking. So these words by this person obviously point out the hypocrisy with this issue. And it connects back to this idea that I made in the introduction. How can we blank, yeah? And ask your reader a question based on the quotation. Or this quotation or this citation from this person essentially says X. And we can see that in the world, this relates to a larger phenomena of Y, yeah? So when you can use that quotation to actually build on it to challenge your reader to think outside of your paper, connected to the world, or you can come full circle with your introductory claim or argument, then I think that it has a really effective place actually in the conclusion. Not all quotations are created equal, obviously. So with that being said, I would make sure that it's something that really has this kind of profound impact on the main message, the purpose of your writing, and the message that you want to convey to your reader, what you want them to walk away with. Yeah, and you can sometimes, you know, toy around with different conclusions, different quotations, see how they play in there. Insert many and then see which one really kind of creates the best question to kind of leave your reader with this final thought to keep them thinking or to connect it to a bigger issue.
Thank you very much, guys.
I'm actually looking for some of these sources. I'm going to put them in the chat for everybody, but also I'll put it in the Facebook comments if you found us there under the link to the video about some of these sources that we use. For example, Joe mentioned the CARS writing method, which is really, really helpful, I think, when it comes to organizing your research, especially your introduction and conclusion to the research in general. So I'm going to paste that there for everybody. Is anybody currently working on an introduction or a conclusion? No?
Yeah, I started thinking, but I have time, so I'm a little bit lazy with that right now. I have also exams, so I'm thinking at least about that.
Yeah. I think with the introduction and conclusions, why we really wanted to focus on this is because even for the most experienced writer, trying to create not just a conclusion or not just an introduction, but an effective one, a profound, maybe something that is actually going to leave your reader with thoughts after leaving your paper. It's going to make them feel worthy of investing the time. I think you really have to kind of let it sit let the ideas simmer, and as Petra mentioned, like revisit them the next day, revisit them the next week. So another part of writing the introduction and conclusion, which maybe we didn't mention yet, is leave yourself enough space and time to actually think about it, to write it more effectively. Because these kinds of rushed methods where we write a paper start to finish, I'm guilty of it too, because I wait until the last minute. These kinds of introductions and conclusions are usually the ones that are the most, stifling, the most bland, full of dead horse sentences. Dead horse, that kind of idea that we're beating a dead horse and we don't want to say it over and over again.
It's always good to reread and rewrite, because when you send to professor or to somebody your final essay, and you'll stay with your thinking and with your ideas that it could be better, but unfortunately it's done, so it's better to do before.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. I hear that actually from a lot of students when we talk about writing projects. They come to me with their second draft. They're like, oh, I wrote it, but I mean, Abbie, could be better if I just had more time. And I'm like, you have a lot of time. And they're like, oh, but I sit down to do it and it just doesn't come. Or I think this is the best I can do. And a lot of times if you kind of reread it together, which is another strategy you can use your peers, use your colleagues in the same field, have them read your introduction and conclusion, maybe even without the body, and see if it kind of pulls them in with the introduction and also leaves them thinking with the conclusion. Because sometimes our best resources are another set of eyes. Sometimes our eyes are kind of univision. We get these blinders on like, horses, and we kind of think, yeah, it makes sense to everybody. It makes sense to me. Perfect, it's golden. Or this is the best I can do. So here you go, professor. A, B, C, give me what you will. And I think that when we want to kind of really improve this, we should use all the tools at our disposal, which is definitely other people. Part of why Joe and I are here. You can use us too.
Also, maybe what I would like to point out, or what I see, sometimes the students, they get stuck that they are rereading too much, like really small parts, and like making really great sentence and this like changing little words and so on. But then they cannot continue then or go further because they are stuck. And so I think that it's really, really useful to write like the whole piece, the whole story that you want to tell, and then reread only. Because also then it's also like for me as a peer, if I'm reading something, I need to have like more complete something like text, and not just the introduction.
Petra, that's another response that I should have given to your earlier question too, and that is because when you pointed out that like in the final the difference, and I think Abbie and I both stressed this in our courses, the difference between the final product, which is for for publication, for consumption, and the process of getting there, and the different types of writing that you may do on the way there. So even for a science students, you can say like, yeah, obviously you're not going to be telling a cute little story in your introduction to a biochemical research paper, but you may try that as a way of as part of the process. So say like write your aha moment, like this research that you're doing. Write about why it's important. Write as if you were writing to someone, you were talking on the phone with them about that. And then what can sometimes happen is that they find language that actually helps them write the final product. And it works the other way around. So I think, again, that's why Abbie and I stress this a little bit more fluid relationship between, academic writing or scientific writing, and you can call it creative writing, or you can call it more, I guess, more personal or casual writing, however you want to say it. But sometimes I suggest to my students, even who are writing, let's say, personal essays or journalistic feature type articles, I say, write the abstract. Try to write the abstract. If this were like a scientific paper, write the abstract of it. What would you actually say you were doing? What are you trying to do with this? Or write your research question, right? Even if it's a personal essay, what is the question that you want to solve? Even if that question is, how do I feel about this, or what do I think about this? Write it as if it's a research question or as an abstract. Yeah, you're not going to put that in the final product, but that might actually help you find words that you are going to put in the final product. Does that make sense?
Yeah, sure. And also a good tip, I would say. Like and also for me, I always try to see it as a reader, how I would feel as a reader of my article or anything. Yeah.
I think the relationship between reader and writer is always a really important one to consider when you're writing any kind of academic article, essay, piece of creative writing. That oftentimes when we are writing as our own reader, we can kind of see what it is we might not necessarily have accomplished yet with our writing, where we may be missing some aspects where we need to explain a little bit more. But also it kind of helps us to clarify our purpose, because as readers, we are a little bit more sensitive to the messages that we want to kind of take away from something. But then also we have to fulfill that role as a writer. And these two can kind of work sometimes in a vicious circle, where they sometimes actually can create a writer's block. Your reader self is saying, there's still just something not right about it. And your writer self is, I just don't know how to explain it in this kind of way. And for that reason, I think that sometimes colleagues or peers can be really effective to get another set of readers' eyes on the article that you're writing, so that you can kind of be sure to reach not just yourself as a reader and things that you think you want to see from your piece of writing, but also perhaps other readers as well. Joe, you wrote a really good piece on the relationship, or the friction between reader and writer. Do you want to maybe summarize that in a bit of a better way than I just have endeavored to do?
I think I like the way you expressed it. Yeah, I don't think I have anything to add, except that, yeah, I mean, just, I guess, yeah, to again emphasize the process and emphasize, because yeah, I think you're right that we can get hung up on, here's the final form this needs to take, and we forget that the steps to getting there don't have to take that final form. We can deviate, we can go in different directions, because that's how we find sometimes the better language, and often the simpler language. Again, I mean, we've all probably had this experience, like we either reading a student's paper or a colleague's paper, you read the introduction, or you read a few sentences and you're like, what is this saying? It's so confusing, and I just don't get it. And then if you are lucky, maybe you have the chance to meet that person face to face, or that student, and you say, can you tell me what you're saying here? And just a crystal clear explanation comes out of their mouth, and you're like, oh, put that in the paper, please. Say it that way in the paper. And especially for English learners, because some of you are not in full command of all the not that anyone is in full command, but I'm saying some of you are not as in command as you would like to be, and you realize that, of the vocabulary and of the best way to say it, the perfect way to say it. So try to forget that. Try to forget the best way of saying it. Try to forget the perfect way of saying it, and just say it as simply and as clearly as you can manage. And then that's when you give it to a teacher, a supervisor, a colleague, and say, you know, do you basically sort of understand what I'm trying to say? Yes. Can you help me make it better, make it perfect the language, make it more specific and interesting. But if you try to make it perfect and try to use the big fancy words and the phrasings and sort of things that you're not fully in command of, as far as you're not really able to use that language to express the basic idea, then what you might produce is nonsense. So just, you know, and when that happens, I always tell students to back up, try to say it. Imagine you're explaining this thing to me face to face. How would you say it? Let's start there. And then from there, we can talk about how to make it more exact, make it more precise. But don't try to flip that process or shortcut that process, because I think that leads to a lot of mistakes and miscommunication. Maybe we have time for maybe one more. If somebody else wants to jump in, maybe a final tip, something we didn't, some aspect of intros and conclusions that you feel we didn't get to or want to comment on.
I have just one question about concrete situation, because I have academic writing subject, and there is supposed to be essay for 1,000 words. How many paragraphs should I write? What do you think? I mean, 3 is not really, like 5 or 7, or kind of that is be 5 is be okay, or not really, or I need 7 maybe, because there is 1,000 words. It's enough for essay, but to explain everything, what is most important, what is really important, and how it's work in real life. But I just curious about how many paragraphs is be okay. Should I write? Like, if somebody know, please.
It's tough to say, Dimitri. I mean, you know, paragraphs, and we could also do I think one of these on paragraphs. It might be useful. Paragraphs are those mysterious things, right? What makes a paragraph? How do we know when one ends and one begins? And it really is, it's one of the most intuitive. I've seen, there's so many explanations of what a paragraph is. Most explanations say 1.1 paragraph. Yeah, but what does that mean? What is 1 point? You know, I always find it funny. And it's really, really difficult to know. But okay, but then the paragraph is it's a connection. The way I understand a paragraph is it's a connection between your brain and your eyes, and like the logic and the aesthetics of the paper, because it's the whole purpose of a paragraph is so that it makes it easier for your eyes to read, right? If you have a huge chunk of text and there's no white space, there's no break in between it, it's much more difficult to read. The reader can't quickly look and see, okay, what are the main ideas? Because when we're reading something quickly, I think we tend to, you know, some of you may have learned this technique of sort of reading the first sentence of each paragraph, and ideally, at least in a certain type of text, maybe in a more scientific or academic text, probably reading those first sentences of each paragraph should give us something like an outline of the paper. So it depends on how many, I guess, how many main points you have in the paper, and try to correspond the number of paragraphs to the number of main points. As to what's the main point, that's for you to decide. And but yeah, essentially a paragraph. Another way of looking at a paragraph is it's the data or the evidence or sorry, the claim that you're making. Like, what is the point or the claim? I'm making an argument here. What is the evidence for that claim? That's another way of looking at it. Like, I think frogs are better than toads. Here's a reason or a couple of reasons why frogs are better than toads. Next point, I also think frogs are the sexiest animal in the world. So here's some evidence for why frogs are the sexiest animal in the world. but beyond that, it's hard to say, Dimitro. Like, you know, we can't. Who knows how many exactly paragraphs are going to be in? There's no rule for that, right? There's no. A paragraph is 100 words or 200 words.
It's 3 sentences, I think, at minimum.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
If I can jump in, maybe I'm going to give a little bit of controversial advice, perhaps in Joe's opinion. I would ask you this 1,000-word response or essay. What is it for? What are you trying to do?
I'm thinking to write about some analysis in finance field.
Okay, an analysis of something in the field of finance, and it needs to only be 1,000 words maximum.
Yeah.
Okay.
Plus minus, but I think 1,000 is enough.
Plus minus, but 1,000 is
10%, yes, but it's okay. 1,000.
So
I use Microsoft Word, so there is continue counting about words here.
So you want to create a rather concise kind of essay or response about an issue related to something in the field of finance. And for that, if you really have this kind of restriction in mind, either it's imposed on you or you want to keep it short and concise yourself, I would say there's 2 ways that I would go about doing that. The first way would be I would kind of plan. If I were going to write an essay, I would plan a really basic kind of essay format. I would either take on a kind of argumentative, persuasive, or just kind of a general 5-paragraph essay, which is going to be really short for 1,000 words, right? So you might need to reduce that 5 paragraphs into 3 paragraphs. And if you wanted to keep them balanced, then I would kind of set a very pedantic word count for each one of those paragraphs. And that word count for each one of the paragraphs that you want to have within your 1,000 words would need to be a particular limit. And how I would go about writing that in the best, most concise, clear way is to first get rid of this idea it needs to be 1,000 words. Write what you think and feel that you want to say about this, topic or idea related to the field of finance. Don't restrict yourself with words in the beginning, in the drafting process, what we talked about last time. Then what you want to do, which maybe we'll do in another Gab episode, is this concept of proofreading and editing. So you can proofread and edit, obviously, to become more clear, more concise, more concrete, eliminate these kinds of repetitive sentences that Petra mentioned earlier that sometimes students suffer from. But you can also edit to be more concise and clear, to kind of shrink your word count. And I encounter this a lot of times when I have to send abstracts for conferences about maybe a thing I think is really complicated and interesting, and I want to explain it in so many words, but my abstract limit is 350 words or 600 words. So if you want to limit it to 1,000 words, I would go about it the same way as I would go about trying to reduce the size of an abstract. First, write it all out. Don't restrict yourself to paragraph form. Don't restrict yourself to word count form. Write what it is you want to say, and then try to organize the thoughts that you've put into your paper. So maybe go through with the highlighter and look at what you've already, said. And yeah, this sentence I think is really important, and I think this idea is really important, and I think this idea is really important. And then what you could begin to do is cut down some of those sentences. Or you could maybe think about phrasing your sentences in a more direct language. Get rid of those unnecessary words and nouns put in to make sentences longer. Put it in maybe the active voice. And then what you could do, oftentimes, because myself, I suffer from this, I have writing blinders on. You could, again, give it to a colleague, give it to a friend, and say, do you think that I should cut anything else out of this? Am I being repetitive? I'm trying to kind of limit my word count here, and I'm trying to write more concisely. And oftentimes getting another reader's perspective on what's more repetitive, or maybe doesn't need to be said, or maybe is kind of tangential or aside from your main message, can help you to reduce it even further. So it's this kind of editing method where you would write a very long kind of summary, go through, reread, give yourself time, obviously, a few days, maybe a couple weeks, so that you have a fresh set of eyes when you come to reread it, and then start striking through sentences that you think don't need or maybe are repetitive. that you can make shorter. And after you give yourself some time doing this, you'll notice that your summary, your essay begins to shrink and shrink and shrink. And once you think that you have everything that you really essentially want to keep in this explanation of the idea related to the field of finance, then I would say keep it and maybe consider a form. If you want to put it in paragraphs, if you want to keep it in one paragraph, that would be up to you. But I would start by doing a method I call overriding, or maybe a little bit grosser, word vomiting, all my ideas onto a paper, organize them, and then begin to edit and get rid of stuff I don't need.
Okay.
Yeah? So don't, in other words, don't start out with this idea that, okay, I'm going to write this thing and it needs to be 1,000 words. Because that's going to give you writer's block, and that's going to create a tremendous amount of stress, and you're still going to end up with those very wordy sentences that maybe are not so important anyway. Yeah.
Actually, maybe specifically for me, but if I have 1,000 words possibility to write, it's much more better than if I limit it with 200 words or 150 words. Really, because you can put more examples in 1,000 words. You can put debate situation. You can put real data and explain everything what is really important. And of course, I would not put some graph in my essay, but you can put real data numbers, for example. Yes. And
Yeah.
this is more attractive than 300 the main information, and it's supposed to be like a kind of conclusion, not a essay for 300 words, and possible to read just for field of finance for students, for example. But the main point, what I'm going to do is to explain how the things are working for our teacher, because it's like he is not from finance field of study, and it's also be a great point in advance to make him understand the situation. And if he can understand, it's possible to understand for everybody. So my job will be done for good points. I hope so.
Definitely, if your audience, the person you're writing for, if they need it explained in a simpler language, then my comment about writing it in maybe active voice, or the most direct way possible, the most simplified and conversational way of explaining something to somebody would be perhaps maybe a more accessible or easy to read approach for this kind of colleague who doesn't really know anything about finance. But yeah, 1,000 words is definitely better than an abstract. You're lucky you don't have to get it down to 300, but essentially cutting down all of your main ideas from maybe a longer piece of writing into a 1,000-word short mini essay or short abstract. It would be the same process as kind of eliminating down to get those 300 words. It's just less intense because you have, more leniency.
More useful, yeah.
Yeah. Maybe abstracts is something we could cover in another talk, because those are really difficult to write. Yeah, getting them to be concise and clear because they are so short. So, do we have any other questions? I think that we are going to end soon now.
Yeah, I was just going to say that's a good segue maybe to an ending. How about you guys? Some of you I know have been with us for the last 2 or 3 of these. So we'd like to hear from you, like maybe, because we're going to do more of these, but maybe you can tell us on the Facebook page, or however you can reach us, where you'd like us to go next. What aspects of writing would you like us to focus on in the next writing gap? So please post on our Facebook page and tell us those types of things. And yeah, and I think as usual, we're gonna post the recording of this and our presentations somewhere, right, Abbie?
Yeah, definitely. Your suggestions would be helpful, because obviously we want to kind of answer your questions rather than focus on what we think is the most important or pressing issues in writing. So thank you to everybody, I know some of us have already left because they needed to due to the time constraints, but thank you everybody for, you know, joining us on a Friday morning to maybe drink coffee, but, you know, of course, talk about writing as well. It's always a pleasure. And we hope we will see you next time, maybe in a couple to 3 weeks, something around abouts. And yes, give us some ideas and have a great weekend. Have a great rest of your day, and we will see you next time. And I'll put those links in the chat if you want to comment.
Thank you so much for your time, for your explanation clear.
So, ciao
Yep.
for now.
Bye everybody. Bye.
See you.